Well, of course, in the political media class, the place has been electrified by two big developments. One was the Joe Biden debate performance. The other, of course, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Anybody in the so-called chattering classes are preoccupied with those two subjects, and there's really not much else that they talk about. Beyond that, in wider America, both of those developments have received attention. They've got some people very upset, but in normal daily life, I have to report to you, and this is probably a good thing, people haven't been too alarmed. Daily life hasn't changed too much. Here in DC, the capital, Washington, where it's a blazingly hot and humid summer, life is going on pretty much as normal, unless you're walking close to the White House, where they've just closed off Lafayette Park in front of the White House, which is always a sign of increased nervousness about security. And people are fairly relaxed on the streets of DC, at least. Although in the streets of Milwaukee this morning, it's different story there, of course.
Indeed. You know, Peter, over the last months, we've spoken about the political climate in America, the sort of violent rhetoric that has sort of tarnished a lot of the political discourse. How much do you think this has contributed to what happened?
Well, it's definitely created the preconditions, if you like, or the conditions of divisiveness, anger, intensity and bitterness, which have fed into what has become another American assassination attempt. And the first one on a president or presidential candidate since Ronald Reagan in 1981. So it's not irrelevant, it's not disconnected.
Yeah. What does it tell you? I mean, you know, you've written about the climate and what has been a lot of an increase in political violence and attacks on people. Take us through some of those that you wrote about.
Yes, well, a combination of factors here which have come together, I think, fairly uniquely for a developed democracy, have come together here in the US to produce what is a continuous and escalating syndrome of political violence. You can go back to 2011 when Gabby Giffords, a Democratic congresswoman, was shot in the head in the street. She recovered, gratefully. 2017, I think it was, when a group of Republican congressmen were playing baseball and were set upon by a gunman who shot 6 people. So these sorts of attacks have been going on continuously, and what we've seen this week is an escalation to that level of presidential candidate. And we are left to wonder whether it's simply chance that a presidential candidate or president hasn't been shot at earlier, whether the Secret Service has just been exceptionally good at its job, or whether this is in fact evidence of an intensification. And we have statistics, we have studies, we have researchers which tell us that since the January 6th riot, insurrection, which was incited, of course, by Donald Trump on the Congress to stop, interrupt, to block the certification of the election result, that has in fact turbocharged violence. Something close to 50 people, almost all of them just regular citizens, have been murdered in the US since the January 6 riots, insurrection, including the bystander who was murdered when Donald Trump was shot the other day, including the man in Ohio a couple of years ago, whose neighbour came in with a gun one day and shot him. The neighbour, the guy with the gun, was a Trump follower, a MAGA fan. The victim's crime, according to his wife, was that the neighbour thought he was a Democrat. So that gives you a sense of of the violence and the bitterness that has gripped the country.
Yeah. Many people are saying now that this is sort of an inevitability, that Trump will ride this to victory. What does history tell us about what impact this has politically, an event like this?
The precedent that people rely on for that conclusion is the Reagan shooting, Ronald Reagan, this attempted assassination attempt in 1981. Now, Reagan handled that very stoically. He was shot, but insisted on walking and nearly died, a bullet an inch from his heart, but he insisted on walking into the hospital unassisted. When he then collapsed, he was jocular with the doctors and nurses when they were operating on him. "I hope you're all Republicans," he famously said as they were about to operate. And his stocks rose. His survival was seen as a metaphor for American revival, and that shaped his near-term popularity, but also set in stone an image of him for the rest of his 2 terms. Whereas there are other precedents, Bev, where it hasn't been so positive. Harry Truman, 1950, Teddy Roosevelt were both presidents who survived assassination and yet went on to lose elections because of the circumstances, because of unpopularity for other reasons. So as the researcher, there's in fact a political historian here who's writing a book on failed assassination attempts of presidents. His name is Matthew Dalek at George Washington University. The word he used when I interviewed him about this was idiosyncratic. He said it's idiosyncratic which presidents have benefited from attempted assassination and which haven't. So it's not automatic, and we'll just have to see what happens in the few months between now and Election Day, because it's not enough. It's neither necessary nor sufficient condition for presidents who've been shot at to then go on to win the following election.
You got the sense that Trump clearly understood the moment he was in. He said he knew that the world was watching when he lifted his head and he gave that fist pump. How do you think he's going to respond? He's talking about changing his speech at the Republican convention to unite the country.
Yes, well, to quote him in the interview he's given overnight my time, he said he was going to give a very tough speech about the horrible, corrupt administration of Joe Biden, unquote, but that he's decided instead to unify the country, as you say, which is a bit like the arsonist, Bev, who then turns firefighter. Trump has been spouting divisive and angry rhetoric for years and now says he wants to unite America and perhaps the whole world, he says. So we shall see. That would be a big change of pace for Donald Trump if he carries through.
Peter, really good to get your perspectives in the US at this point. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Beth.